Good morning, everyone. I'll start by saying big thank you to Invest&I for organizing the webinar in these uncertain times, a very timely webinar. As Anne said, I've been working with the organization during the last uncertainty moment, which was Brexit and the Windsor framework or the protocol before that. So I'm very glad to be back, and also very happy to be doing this webinar with Jonathan, who is a good colleague who I discuss these topics with and check out our understanding of what's going on. Jonathan is also someone I consider to be absolutely best in the business when it comes to applying the Windsor framework. And whenever I have a client with a product moving in and out of Northern Ireland, I definitely always pass them to Jonathan. So very excited to hear his presentation as well. Right, can we move to the first slide, please? Thank you. So you'll notice I didn't start with a tariff timeline, and there's a reason for that. I wanted to stress this point that Anne made at the beginning around uncertainty and how these are really unprecedented times. And you have here a graph from Bloomberg, but it just to kind of give you an idea of, if we look at trade policy, this really isn't what we're used to. And starting from applying tariffs on your closest allies to how these tariffs are applied, meaning announcing things on Truth Social, announcements of tariffs that go into force the next day, the changes, the back and forth. We thought that Brexit had a lot of U-turns, but this is making Brexit look like a very stable and thought through process. So if you are struggling with keeping up in terms of these tariffs and developments, just know that this is absolutely normal. It's very hard at this point to keep up and understand what's happening. And I mean, for companies, for logistics industry, it's just been a very difficult. Someone pointed out that it's not even been 90 days. I think we've all aged substantially in the last 90 days since Trump was sworn in. So I'll come back to the tariffs and the timeline, but just wanted to give you a bit of illustration of how these tariffs, what do they look like at the moment. Can we move to the next slide, please? So this is from the New York Times. This was posted on Saturday, and this I just wanted to give you an illustration. Again, we'll come back to what these tariffs are in a second, but just to give you an illustration of all the different tariffs we have. So I'll start by kind of coming back to the original tariffs, because before Trump, we also had actual tariffs, normal tariffs, the kind of third country tariffs that were in place. We also had some legacy tariffs from Trump's first presidency, some special tariffs, especially when it comes to China and certain products. Then since January, we have a range of tariffs that have been applied, revoked, postponed, and so on, which is why, again, a timeline is quite difficult to make at this point. But just to give an overview, we had the Mexico and Canada 25% tariffs. They were applied, they were postponed. Then there was a clarification that goods under UNSCA or COMESA, so the second NAFTA, the trade agreement between Mexico, Canada, and the US, would still be, if they qualify for the trade agreement and preferential treatment, will still be 0%. And if these additional tariffs are removed, Canada and Mexico will still be subject to 12.5% tariffs if they don't qualify for the trade agreement. We have the steel and aluminium and derivative products, 25% tariffs with some exemptions, and I'll come back to all this a bit later. The steel and aluminium tariffs were also the first ones to include US content calculations. So this is a clause that says that if you have some US content in your derivative product, you can calculate these the amount of US content and subtract it from the final value of the product to lower your duty bill. In practice, and again, we can come back to this later, but in practice, this is quite difficult, and a lot of companies ended up paying full tariffs instead of doing the calculations because they didn't have the documents or didn't know how to proceed with these calculations. We have Another set of tariffs for cars and car parts. Part of this already went into force for cars, again with exemptions. Car parts, the tariffs for that we know, or we expect them to come or to be applied in May. We'll see whether this actually happens. And then we had the April 2 tariffs, the tariff day, also called Liberation Day, where we had 10% baseline for everyone, and then well, they were called reciprocal. There was nothing reciprocal about them, but kind of additional punitive tariffs with, again, an annex to listing all the goods that will not be subject to these tariffs, including all the goods subject to previous tariffs, and also US content calculations based on non-preferential origin. I'll come back to this later on as well. And then we had additional China fentanyl tariffs of 20%, and then additional punitive tariffs applied because China retaliated. So it's just a very complex network of tariffs. Some are added on top of the others, some are not. Can we move to the next slide, please? Again, this is tariffs on China in this particular example, and this example, the point here is to first of all go again back to this, how these tariffs are applied, how the list of exemptions, how every single tariff comes with its own exemptions, conditions, categories, and the different ways in which it's being applied. Some of them are cumulative, some are not, depending on what the executive order says. So what ends up happening is that you have this matrix of products and different tariffs that apply or do not apply to these products. And as a result, I think it's quite interesting that things that we thought originally will be subject to the highest tariffs, for example, where the steel and aluminium tariffs were applied, ended up actually not being subject to the highest tariffs, and things that ended up being subject to the highest tariffs were not the ones that we initially thought would be the case. So I think this is an interesting illustration of what's going on at the moment. Can we move to the next slide, please? Okay, so as I said at the beginning, I think timelines are quite difficult at the moment, but I want to use this as an example to kind of show you just how volatile this environment is, and how and why some of the things that I'm going to be talking about in a second when it comes to what companies can do about these tariffs and how they can prepare, why that is important. Because we really, especially in the last week, we had well, pretty much since the 2nd of April, but last week in particular, the level of changes in uncertainty was just completely off the charts. So I mentioned that we had this executive order and or series of executive orders on the 2nd of April, introducing the baseline tariff for everyone, including some uninhabited islands, which caused a lot of confusion. And then we had the additional tariffs applied per country. And then the same executive order talked about this calculation of US versus non-US content, provided that the product had at least 20% of US content when compared to the final value of the product. So this was applied on, or this was announced on the 2nd of April, with the 10% going live on the 5th and the reciprocal tariffs going live on the 9th. This executive order also included some other information or some other announcement, and they'll be mentioned later in this slide. Some of these things were not necessarily very clear, and I think this is one of the things we all deal with at the moment, that the executive orders do not necessarily cover all the details. And before the US Customs, so CBP, Customs and Border Protection Department, is able to issue guidance and some clarification, some of these tariffs and some of these measures already go into force. Trade agreements that US has still apply. I'll come back to this later as well. Mexico and Canada were excluded from these April 2nd tariffs, and they're only subject to their own punitive tariffs that I mentioned, to 25%, minus tariffs on energy, because they're subject to lower tariffs. That's and ingredients to make fertilizers, that's 10%. And of course, if they qualify for preferential treatment, they can be duty-free. That executive order also mentioned the end of de minimis for China and Hong Kong, and that's supposed to stop on the 2nd of May. De minimis is a special procedure for goods of low value, so that's in the US below $800. These goods are not subject to customs duties or any traditional full customs procedures. We can come back to this later as well. This is one of the I wouldn't call it a loophole because it's a trade facilitation measure, but it's one of the ways in which companies have been avoiding some of the tariffs, is sending them below that threshold. This will now be closed for China as of the 2nd of May, but we've also had an announcement that this will be closed for everyone else at a later date. So at the moment, this is available. From the 2nd of May, this will not be available for China and Hong Kong, and then later on, we don't know the date yet, it will stop being available for everyone. So we also had Annex 2 published a couple days later, and this included a list of goods that will be exempt from these tariffs. Then a few days later, last week, the reciprocal tariffs were paused for 90 days, except for China. These were increased from 84% to, well, depending how you calculate, to 125% on goods that were subject to these tariffs because China retaliated. And this pause in general, one of the ways to look at it is that this was Trump's way of starting bilateral negotiations for deals. However, we are very unsure what these deals could be, because initially several countries announced that they are happy to take down their tariffs to zero for the US. And then the US came back saying that this is not good enough. Whether that's the case or not, we'll see. At the moment, what we're seeing is that we're hearing something one day for this to be debunked and said this is fake news, and then it happens the next day, like we had with the 90-day pause. So on Friday night, our Friday night, I think our Sunday is Saturday morning, or given the time difference. Anyway, from a US perspective, on a Friday night, a clarification was published to Annex 2, and the kind of the exemptions from those tariffs was announced. This was supposed to be just a clarification. However, whether this was done on purpose or not, it added additional products, including smartphones, computers, and so on. So that clarification meant that there's a whole new set of products were exempt from these tariffs and were kind of put in a different category. What happened then was that there was a glitch, because if you apply tariffs overnight, it will, it's very likely that the IT system will not be able to keep up. There was a glitch, meaning these exemptions were not applied, and this led to the fact that some companies paid the tariffs and now can get a refund from customs. So this is all a week and a half. So just to kind of give you and a kind of a snapshot of just how much is happening and how quickly things are changing. Can we move to the next slide, please? So this is just again, just to give you an idea of some of these kind of comments that we're seeing. Some of these tariffs and the exemptions led to and you can see this in an example. This is from X. You can see it in the second example, that the exemptions basically do not necessarily follow what Trump's policy is around bringing manufacturing back home. However, since then, this was posted on Saturday. Since then, we've also learned that semiconductors, which is what Trump calls all these products that were exempt, including smartphones and laptops, they will be subject to new tariffs shortly. So this is already out of date. Again, this was Saturday, that's already out of date. We already have investigation into semiconductors, and we are expecting to hear something maybe even this week about new tariffs on semiconductors. Okay, can we move to the next slide, please? Okay, so what are we expecting? Or what can we expect? The tariffs that are in place are likely to stay in place. So steel and aluminium tariffs and the calculations are likely to stay in place. Auto and so cars and car parts, the ones that are in place, so for cars likely to stay, car parts likely to go into force. We'll see whether it's still a beginning of May or will the date change. We know that negotiations or conversations are going on for some of those additional tariffs. They have been posed for 90 days, but definitely expect them to come back, or expect this topic to come back. We know that there will be more sectoral tariffs. So we know that semiconductors are probably the next tariffs in line. We'll also have tariffs on pharma, which was excluded from those 2nd April announcements. Lumber, we have a couple of other industries that have been mentioned here and there, but these three are the most likely. We know that that's likely to happen soon. What we're seeing again, that this US, non-US content calculations are coming back in some of these tariffs. So again, this is something that is probably worth looking at and worth thinking about now before we have more tariffs in place, because this is something that we've seen for the second time, and the first one was with steel and aluminium on a small scale, but with these April 2nd reciprocal tariffs, that would apply to everyone for all products. So there's definitely one to keep an eye out for and start thinking about how this will be done throughout the supply chain. As I mentioned, yeah, the special tariffs will come back, the topic will come back. And then the last kind of point is that at least in my view, this state of kind of constant firefighting, constant urgency, and constant state of crisis, that is something that is probably going to continue throughout Trump's second term. So this is something that we'll need to find a way to kind of manage, because it's unlikely that he will stop. But whether it be as extreme as it has been, that remains to be seen. At the bottom here, you just have a screenshot from announcement that was made, and this is the in this investigation into semiconductors that started, I think, on Monday. And I think companies have, or stakeholders have time until Wednesday to provide their views for these tariffs. Okay, can we move to the next slide, please? Okay, so having kind of provided a broad picture of just how volatile and difficult the environment is, what can companies do to prepare for what's coming next? Can we move to the next slide, please? Thank you. So key steps or key kind of points to bear in mind, and we'll drill down into the detail in just a second. So first of all, I would suggest that you look at each of the tariff slightly separately, because when you actually read through the executive orders and the guidance, they are all slightly different in the way that they're applied, and they obviously are applied under different American legislation. So some are for national security, some are for state of emergency. You hear these terms mentioned, Section 232. IEEPA and so on. So, but what it means in practice, what's important for companies exporting to the US is that they will have different provisions, different timelines. So when they're applied, they will have, for example, each executive order will have a section that tells you if the goods are already in transit, so if the goods already left, at what is the time, what is the deadline that they have to be loaded into onto a container, onto a ship in a port for them to still be considered tariff-free, and at which point the tariffs start to apply. So that is in every single executive order. Treatment of free zones, so warehouses, drawback, de minimis, all this is in every single executive order. and they can differ. Some of the executive orders mention free zones, some of them do not. So again, each of them is applied in a slightly different way. And then, of course, they all have the special codes that is provided in the customs guidance. Related to this second point, unfortunately, because of this, we all need to at least read or get familiar with reading executive orders, proclamations, and CBP guidance, and also clarification. So the US IT system for customs is called ACE, and then the CBP, so the US Customs team, has a system where the Cargo System Management Service, CSMS. You don't have to worry about these, but it's good to subscribe to those notifications so you get the latest information. Again, we normally wouldn't be suggesting companies to follow customs guidance of a country of export, but again, with how quickly things change, this really is one of the only ways to stay on top of things. Point number 3, not all guidance will be provided. This is just to say that because things are happening and changing so quickly, some of these executive orders, some of the guidance will not have all the information you need. So an example of this was that when on the April the 2nd, when tariffs were announced, one thing that we weren't necessarily clear on. So one of the things that was not in any of the documents provided was the treatment of trade agreements. So US has a number of trade agreements, and if you have these additional tariffs on countries like South Korea or Australia, what does it mean for trade agreements? And again, this wasn't mentioned in any of the guidance, wasn't clarified. The way I actually figure this out was to call a customs broker in the US and ask them whether they can still put this through the customs system that I mentioned, ACE. So this is to say that those relationships you have with your clients will be important, and sometimes you will be relying on the kind of communication with your clients throughout the supply chain to try to figure some of these things out, because in certain cases, again, if things are applied so quickly, the only way to find the information is to speak to someone on the ground, and that means building these relationships and having these contacts so you can ask questions when you need to. Point number 4, check who you're getting guidance from. If you remember Brexit, around Brexit time, everyone was an expert in customs. This is exactly what's happening now. Make sure you're getting guidance from a reliable source, especially if it's paid guidance. Make sure you check that LinkedIn might not be the best source for information. There's a lot of I wouldn't even say misinformation, just a lot of confusion. So even with best intentions, sometimes it's difficult to provide good information. And also, if you provide something, 1 hour, the next hour it can already change. So be careful with that. Point number 5, and we'll come back to this in just a second. Because these are US tariffs, everything that we talk about, and I'm going to mention in just a second, is based on US laws. So these tariffs are applied based on US laws and US legislation and US rules. So when we in a second come back and talk about origin, classification, valuation, special procedures, ways to minimize duty, that is all based on the US version of these provisions. So when we talk about classification, this is not how we would classify things in EU or the UK. This is how they would classify things in the US. So those differences between how we do things and how they do things in the US will be important. And again, this is why you kind of, if you speak to someone, make sure that they are providing information based on the interpretation in the US. Point number 6, again, just to review contracts in Incoterms, just to make sure who is the importer into the US. Is it you as an exporter, depending on the Incoterms and contract? Who's got that liability? Again, these relationships throughout supply chain will be very important. And point 7, review the customs basics, and this is where we will focus on now, is just those little things that you can do to either avoid some of these tariffs or minimize them in certain cases. Can we move to the next slide? Yes, next one, please. Thank you. Okay, so classification, we all know more or less, how classification works. Classification will still be important for sectoral tariffs and for any kind of exemptions that we have in those broader tariffs. So origin is definitely the star of the show, but classification is still important if you can reclassify your products from a good that is subject to sectoral tariffs into something that's not. That will definitely help. Again, and I cannot stress this enough, it refers to the classification at the point of import, as always. So classification based on US tariff and US interpretation of the tariff. You have a link to the tariff, this will be provided. So you have the link to the US tariff. If you're not familiar with it, again, either get someone to help you with this or just start having a look at this. The way we have in the UK and in the EU, we have classification rulings. In the US, they also have classification rulings, and that can be, reading some of these rulings can be a way to familiarize yourself with the way US Customs thinks about classification and how they do things slightly differently than what we do. Can we move to the next slide? Thank you. I've left this slide in just in case there's anyone. I think you're all familiar with the difference between non-preferential and preferential origin, but just wanted to mention this very quickly, just in case there's anyone who's not familiar with the difference between the two. Preferential origin is the one that we use for trade agreements. So this is the one we would use under the TCA, the Trade and Cooperation Agreement between the UK and the EU. This is the one we would use for any kind of other trade agreements that the UK has or the EU has. So this is the one that's written into the actual trade agreement. However, whether you have a trade agreement or not, there's the second type of origin, non-preferential origin, that's applied at all cases. So every good traded, whether there's an agreement or not, has to have non-preferential origin. And in most cases, this is not particularly relevant unless there are things like quotas, anti-dumping duties, safeguard duties, and so on, countervailing measures, and so on. So unless there's a reason for this to be important, traditionally it has not been very important. Now with those tariffs, especially if we have a difference between tariffs applied to the UK and the EU, like we had on the 2nd of April, where UK had 10% and EU had 20%, that would be incredibly important for Northern Ireland, because that would mean, a difference of 10% depending on how you determine this non-preferential origin. It's also becoming very important for sustainability in the EU, but it's another topic. But just to kind of mention, so these are these two. So when I refer to preferential, non-preferential, you'll see where these are. Can we move to the next slide, please? So preferential origin, again, traditionally the most important one, but here it's taking a bit of a backseat. It's still relevant for those countries where the US has a trade agreement. So again, I mentioned South Korea, I mentioned Japan, Australia, but it only offers the discount on this basic most favored nation, so third country tariff rate. So if you have, I forgot what the reciprocal ones were for South Korea or Australia, but if you had 25, 35% additional tariff and you get a discount on those basic tariffs, and the basic tariff, let's say it's 6%, it's not a lot, but it can help a little bit. So for those supply chains that still move under some of the trade agreements between the US and the third party, you may be able to use, well, you should be able to use preferential origin to lower your duty bill slightly, but that again is the US and the kind of third party trade agreement. So this would need to be checked. This is not going to help for the UK or the EU because we don't have, neither of the countries has an agreement with the US. Okay, can we move to the next slide, please? So here we're moving to non-preferential origin, and this is, again, when we had those reciprocal tariffs on the 2nd of April with differences. So every country got their own rate of tariff. Some were incredibly high, especially for developing and least developed countries. here the non-preferential origin determination would be crucial. Now this has been paused and everyone has the 10%. It still can be important in some cases. The most important one is whether the goods are Chinese or not Chinese. So China is up to 143%, depending on which product. So of course, the difference between a Chinese product and a Vietnamese product at this point is substantial. And this is a bit of a side point, but during Trump's first term, when we had additional tariffs on China, the first round of additional tariffs on China, a lot of countries diversified and moved to Cambodia, Vietnam, and so on. And these countries ended up being the biggest winners from kind of Trump's first term in terms of investment and production. At the moment, for the next 90 days at least, these supply chains still work. If these countries get hit by additional punitive tariffs, this will need to be revisioned, and a big shift in supply chains might be necessary. Non-preferential origin, just like classification, is also based on the US understanding of this. I'll come back to this in a second. Non-preferential origin will also be important for those US, non-US content calculations. Again, here, the executive orders and the guidance will give you a formula or understanding of how this needs to be calculated on a high level. So for the steel and aluminium, we had a sentence that said that it's the non-preferential origin based on substantial transformation of the non-US part versus the full value of the product. This is high level, but it gives you something to go with, and I'll come back to this again in a second. Non-preferential rules traditionally have always been less defined than preferential rules because, as I mentioned, unless there's a reason for them, they don't matter as much. There are some international conventions and some international guidelines, but each country can define these rules in a different way. So we have two main principles, which you might also know from the other type of origin, wholly obtained. So this is for products that come from one country in their entirety, and it's difficult to dispute the product. If a cow was born and raised in one country, it's wholly obtained, at least in general for Northern Ireland. This was always the example we used for Brexit, because if a cow also walks across the border several times a day, that makes things a little bit more complex. And then we have substantial transformation, which is the key term for non-preferential origin. Let's move to the next slide. Thank you. So I mentioned this already, non-preferential rules will be the ones that matter for those tariffs. What we do in the EU and the UK, if we want to say something under non-preferential origin, I mean, we always say under non-preferential origin because it's required on the customs declaration, but if we want to get a certificate or confirmation, for example, if we export to Vietnam, we are going to ask for a certificate of non-preferential origin from a local chamber of commerce. In the US, they look at this differently. So an important point here that any certificate of non-preferential origin you get from the UK or the EU will not matter. A good colleague of mine, a Canadian origin expert, Brian Staples, has worked a lot with Vietnam. Some of you might have heard of him, and he kind of seen it firsthand, where the Vietnamese customs were providing certificates of non-preferential origin. In Vietnam, they're called Form B. And US customs were just basically rejecting them and saying that they do not approve or they do not take into consideration non-preferential origin certificates from a country of export. US customs applies their own rules and decides how non-preferential origin will be interpreted. In the EU, we have quite detailed guidance and legislation around non-preferential origin. We have product-specific rules, we have list rules, we have quite a lot of information to base our determination on. In the US, you don't have a lot. It's really just high level stuff. You have a Congress document which outlines the main principles. You have a link to that. You have CBP guidance that there's a screenshot on the next slide. So I'll come back to this in a second. And that guidance again is very high level, and they have case law, which in this case is customs rulings. That again, I mentioned the classification rulings. We also have origin rulings in the US, and this is kind of the body of the case law and US interpretation. And as they say themselves, it's inherently subjective. If we can move to the next slide. So this is a quote from the Congress document, and again, it says it very clearly that it's based to CBP, so the US Customs interpretation of facts, and it is subjective. Next slide, please. Thank you. So this is an element from the guidance on substantial transformation from the CBP website, and it talks here about substantial transformation, so changing the product that's imported into the US in order to be considered. Let's say if you manufacture something in China, then you send it to the UK and you process further in the UK. For this product to be considered of UK origin when it is imported into the US, it has to, in the UK, undergo a fundamental change in form, appearance, nature, or character, which is resulting as a result of processing or manufacturing. So this is a very high level definition, and the interpretation of it has been quite a subject of quite a lot of discussions. It's you know, it cannot be a simple transformation, cannot be a simple assembly. At the beginning, you know, a couple of years ago, for example, we were discussing things like, okay, if you need special tools for the assembly, then perhaps this is enough to make this a substantial transformation. As time went by with the additional tariffs, the interpretation from US Customs got quite it got a bit more strict, and now we're seeing that you really need to change the product into something different for substantial transformation to apply or to be approved by US Customs. You also need to, when you apply for this exemption at import, you need to provide some information, and if CBP checks, you need to provide detailed description of why you think this is substantial transformation. Just to give you a couple of examples, and we can come back to this in questions because I'm running out of time, but just to give you a couple of examples, one example that I find incredibly interesting that's on the CBP's website itself is an example of frozen mix of vegetables. So if you bring vegetables, fresh vegetables from different countries into, let's say, the UK, and you transform these vegetables into a frozen mix of vegetables, that process from a carrot to a carrot that's in a frozen mix of vegetables is not considered sufficient from the US Customs perspective. And again, you know, it's sometimes counterintuitive. There's definitely a kind of push for making ensuring that the product that ends up, that the result of the transformation has a completely different character, has a completely different use, and is different than the parts and components. And again, we can come back to some examples and more detailed definition in questions. The implications of that for NI, again, if we have the differences in terms of tariffs between UK and the EU, it's going to be incredibly difficult to determine non-preferential origin for some of these products. I think this is something that CBP has not even considered yet, and probably, you know, something that will need further clarification. Can we move to the next slide, please? I'm just going to briefly mention a couple more points. Again, we can come back to non-preferential origin during questions and answers. On valuation, I mentioned that the minimum is this threshold of $800. If you send anything below, it still works for the time being. There have been some more creative ways of reducing your tariff bill proposed by some accounting firms. You have here also a headline from the FT. One of them is around excluding royalties, which can work in some cases. And the other one is around fair sale for export. So fair sale is a process whereby if you have a manufacturer and companies, kind of a middleman in between, and then you have the final importer in the US. In some cases, you can use the first sale before the middleman as the basis for customs valuation. Lower customs value means lower tariffs, lower duty, because duty is calculated as a percentage of the value. Both of these have been advertised as a ways to minimize your bill, but again, it will only work in certain cases. I think there's a tendency now for different kind of consulting companies or accountants to advertise ways of minimizing the bill, but you have to be quite careful with these procedures because they don't always work. Speaking to US-based customs lawyers, for fair sale for export, the majority of these claims end up failing and end up being rejected. So if anyone is offering you a way out of these tariffs, again, be very careful because these methods only apply to a very selected number of examples, and it's on a case-by-case basis. Can we move to the next slide? Yep, next slide, thank you. So just to finish up very quickly, there are other exemptions, and again, these are very small and narrow cases in which can work in certain supply chains, but this needs to be assessed and reviewed on a case-by-case basis. If you had goods that are returned or repaired, there are ways to minimize your duty bills if your product fits that description. Personal items and so on. There's a whole list of exemptions in Chapter 98 of US tariffs. They are being used, and I know, for example, Canadian lawyers are working quite hard to fit some of the supply chains in those very narrow terms. But again, be very careful with that because unless it's very difficult to push some of the supply chain into these small categories, and you risk this being rejected. And then can we move to the final slide, please? Okay, so just a summary very quickly. This is just the beginning in terms of the chaos we're likely to see for the next 3 and almost 4 years. Please remember that all the US tariffs are applied on US rules. So what we know about classification, origin, and so on, we need to look at this from the US perspective and the way the US interprets things. In the US, the importer has the duty of care, as that's being referred to. This is similar in the UK and the EU as well, but in the US, what that means that you do need to, as the importer, show that you've really looked at these rules. You can get an opinion from a US-based customs lawyer, and you can get a ruling on origin or classification from the US customs authorities. And if you follow these steps, that will be considered that the duty of care was fulfilled. Compliance, like in the UK and the EU, is determined after importation. So just because the goods got through doesn't mean that they won't be assessed later. So also be prepared for that CBP might be doing audits later on and might be checking these non-preferential origin determinations and so on. Please make sure you check the US guidance and legislation. Another point is that US customs, because there's so many things happening at the same time, might be overstretched. So compliance is very likely to be low. We've also seen that some brokers, and I've even had a case of this yesterday, that some brokers, someone told me that about this, offer to help by declaring incorrect origin or classification and so on. This is still non-compliance, even though CBP probably doesn't have time to look at this now. This is still non-compliant. So if you're taking risks, please be aware of potential consequences. And then the final point is ensure you work closely with your US clients and throughout the supply chain, because that level of uncertainty really needs to be managed by the entire supply chain. And there are some things that only the importer can influence. So I'll stop here, and I'm more than happy to come back to some of this in questions. As you can imagine, there's a lot to cover and a lot of things happening very, very quickly. Thank you so much.